لا إله إلا الله.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Umar Nasser, and I'm going to be giving this brief talk on evolution from an Islamic perspective. We won't be able to go through this in depth because of the time available, but hopefully, inshallah, it's still going to be useful as a top level overview of some of the most important issues within this major topic. Now, why is this even an issue? How did this become such a contentious topic? The answer is because throughout history, one of the major arguments for the existence of God has been look around. Look around at nature. Look at the amazing organisms and creatures that we have. Look at the wings, the colors. Look at how every organism seems to be so perfectly suited to its environment, so perfectly suited for the function that it performs in nature. Look at ourselves and our hands and our eyes and our brains and our hearts. How can we say that this came from anything other than an intelligent creator, an all-powerful mind that has, created us like this? This has been one of the major arguments for God, and it's something that instinctively people have, and even atheists, acknowledge this. This is a powerful, powerful argument. The reason why evolution became contentious is because essentially Darwinian evolution was a way of undermining that argument. It was a way of saying that we can explain the appearance of design in the living world, in all of these natural creatures, without actually having a designer, without having God. And this was a theory which was pioneered by Charles Darwin, as we know, also a man called Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-founder of the theory, but he later went on to say that evolution was directed by God and was subsequently written out of the history books. So we're going to focus on the kind of more pure Darwinian form of the argument. And in the modern day, this is called neo-Darwinism. And I'm sure you all are very familiar with this, so I won't labor the point. The idea here is very, very simple. And it's the idea that everything around you can be explained with reference to random variation and natural selection. So you have random mutations, random changes, and there's a variety within a species, and you change your selection pressure, and some things survive more than others. Right? And then those things pass on their genes. So a common example, for instance, is bacteria. So that's why you have antibiotic resistance. You have a bunch of people in a population having antibiotics. Some bacteria can survive that. They just by chance have some kind of mutation that allows them to survive that antibiotic. And then you have resistance because those bacteria are able to survive. They reproduce. They pass on those genes, and they overcrowd the population as a whole, and all the other ones that were sensitive to the antibiotic die out. So that's, what they call microevolution. That's small-scale changes within a species. We also saw this, Darwin saw this, for instance, on the Galapagos Islands. And in the Galapagos Islands, you have birds called finches, and some of them have bigger beaks and some of them have smaller beaks. And what they found was because when in times of famine, you had seeds which were much harder to break into. Only the birds with the bigger beaks were able to break into it, so they became the major ones on the island. But when there wasn't famine and there were more softer seeds everywhere, then the ones with the smaller beaks came back. So it was a good example of natural selection. So the idea then of the big idea of evolution, of Darwinian evolution in particular, is that these small-scale changes over time can explain everything, can explain all of life. Because what they say is, you may think they're just small-scale changes within a species which aren't actually that important. Like, you may think they're just small, but actually if you give something enough time, you can get from a bacteria to you and me. You give a bacteria a few hundred million years, or a population of bacteria a few hundred million years, it's going to go from that bacteria to me, because what's going to happen is you can have a changing environments one after the other, and nature is going to select for greater sophistication and greater complexity, right? And therefore, it's going to end up in me and you. There's a few key problems with that, and we're going to very briefly outline them. The first is that that's wrong logically, because there's no reason why nature is going to progressively select for more sophistication and more complexity. What nature is going to select for is whatever is right at that particular time. If a volcano goes off next to me now, then I will die despite being a more sophisticated biological organism, but some bacteria that are able to survive in high temperatures may all survive, right? environments, especially if they're not coordinated by God, environments are just randomly one after the other. They're not going to necessarily say, okay, well, I want this thing to survive because in 20 million years, this is going to become something really important. They're just going to kill whatever they're going to kill in that population, right? So that doesn't work. You can't have environments selecting for future fitness. So it's a logical fallacy at the heart of it. So you're not going to have greater sophistication, greater complexity over time. The second thing is that when we say, where did this bird come from? I don't want an argument saying, well, its ancestors didn't die. It's like, yeah, I know that. What I want actually, when I'm asking that question, is I want a creative process. What is the creative process that got me this? And it can't be selection, because selection is not a creative process, it is a culling process. You can only select what already exists. Natural selection is a theory of death. It explains how some things die more than others. It's not therefore a theory of life. It can't explain how you actually produce something. It's like if I'm an interviewer and 3 candidates come in the building and I say no, no, yes, right? I want you get the job. I've selected that person. I didn't give birth to that person, right? I'm just saying you can stay in the building. So selection is not a creative process. So when I ask, how did this come to be? I want a creative process, and the creative process of Darwinian evolution is random mutations. These are typos in the genetic code. We know from our experience, if you make random changes in a Word document, you're going to have a bad document. You're going to have an unreadable document. We know from computers that if you start making random changes in scripts and codes, you're not going to have Windows 10 becoming Windows 20. You're going to have a bad, broken version of Windows 10, right? So immediately you see the problems. How does this work really? If you're saying that the creative process is random mutations, you're not going to produce great biological complexity through accidents. And that's what their theory essentially says that it comes through accidents. So this is basically saying that the whole of biological world has come about through chance, and they dress it up as selection, but it doesn't work. And Khalifa Rabe has talked about this in a very eloquent way. He said, naturalists claim that both the function of creation and the function of selection are performed by forces which are separate yet work in perfect unison. They would have us believe that the mindless genes create and a formless, impersonal law of natural selection selects. But there has to be some creation before natural selection can begin to work. It is this dilemma which the proponents of natural selection can never resolve. And this book, Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth, by Khalifa Rabe, is the best refutation of neo-Darwinism out there. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the evidence that has come out against this, just from the empirical evidence side of things. What they have found is that even when Darwinian evolution works in those small-scale, changes within populations, it doesn't work by creating loads of new genes. In fact, that's vanishingly rare. In fact, it's essentially never been observed in any kind of significant way or to a significant level. What we see actually is that if things adapt to new environments, they invariably adapt by breaking genes. And this is what they found with these finches. These are the finches that I spoke about earlier. And what they found when they actually did the genetic analyses here is that the way that they changed their beak sizes is through breaking their genes. And it's the same with bacteria. Some of our biggest studies, pretty much the biggest studies on evolution in the lab, has been something called the long-term evolution experiments. And they've replicated bacteria over like 70,000 generations. And they found that some of them become more fit. In fact, some of them reproduce like 70% faster, and they're bigger and they're better in that specific environment. How do they do it? They broke down their genes. Because that particular environment, they didn't need all their genes. And it was like a burden, right? In the same way that if I'm in a car and I'm trying to drive fast, if I eject, all of my chairs and passengers potentially, I'm going to go faster. My passengers might be slightly annoyed, but I'm going to go faster. So in this situation, and in many situations, evolution works on that small scale, microevolution, by breaking down genes. In fact, you break down genes much more quickly than you ever make anything even vaguely new. So the empirical evidence has come out against neo-Darwinism. They don't really accept it, but the writing's on the wall. If you want to know more about the empirical evidence against neo-Darwinism, I'd recommend these 2 books. Darwin Devolves and Darwin's Doubt. These are two excellent books which go through it from a very rigorous scientific point of view. Let's now talk about Islam and evolution specifically. A lot of people think that Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. It's not true. In fact, the Muslims had spoken about evolution at length. This was revealed quite clearly in a book in 1874, a very famous book by John William Draper, called The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion. And in that book, he says this. He says, theological authorities were constrained to look with disfavour on any attempt to carry back the origin of the earth to an epoch indefinitely remote. So basically saying the church didn't want the earth to be old. The church didn't want the earth to be old because the Bible said that it was only a few thousand years old. And on the Muhammadan theory of the evolution of man from lower forms, or his gradual development to his present condition in the long lapse of time. So this is a Victorian author who's saying that the evolution of man was a Muhammadan theory. Now, Muhammadan is how Westerners spoke about Muslims before they knew any. They called us Muhammadans. So the Muhammadan theory is saying the Islamic theory of the evolution of man from lower forms. Now, this is very significant because Victorians generally didn't like to credit Muslims with, more than was necessary and sometimes a lot less than that. But here they're saying that, this guy is saying, who's a very famous historian, that evolution was a Muslim idea. Okay, how did he get that idea? Is that true? It is true. Actually, we have multiple references to evolution in old texts by Islamic scholars and groups of scholars. So, for instance, Al-Jahiz, who was, over 1,000 years now, over 1,000 years ago, great scholar, who spoke about evolutionary processes. The Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan as-Safa, who are a group of scholars. Rumi, Hazrat Jalaluddin Rumi, rahimahullah, spoke about evolution as well in some of his poetry. So it was a well-known idea. How did it come to be? Were these Muslims just super smart? Well, they were smart, but they weren't smart enough to come up with these kind of new things. This was from the Qur'an. And the Qur'an speaks about this in a few different places. Here's one verse, or one set of verses. What is the matter with you that you do not ascribe dignity to Allah? And certainly He has created you in stages. And Allah has raised you from the earth like the raising of vegetation. This is what Khalifa Sani said about this verse. He said, what clearly emerges from this subject matter is that the Qur'an supports an opinion that man was born through an evolutionary process, but not one that occurred by chance. In fact, it speaks of the birth of man through stages, without, however, approving of the idea that the particle destined to become human was at any point in time anything other than human. So Khalifa Sani is saying that the Qur'an is saying that Islam approves in principle of the idea of evolution, but it does not approve of the idea that evolution happened by chance. It does not approve of the idea that, we just happen to somehow come out from a bacteria to me and you, and that's just a really lucky coincidence. It's saying that Allah Ta'ala intended for an early form of life to become human, prepared for it, and shaped the ecosystem in order for that to happen. In modern ways of thinking about it, we'll understand this. Allah Ta'ala must have guided the mutations or guided the genetics and the cellular functions in order to eventually produce something which is more and more human and to produce humans in the end, and also guided the environments so that they were shaped to select for and to cater for something which would eventually produce humans, but not just humans, because there's a whole ecosystem that has to develop in order to support even one organism and ultimately to support us now. So Allah Ta'ala must have arranged the whole thing so that lots of different things evolved and emerged and produced an ecosystem that allowed us to eventually not only exist but also to thrive. Here's another verse. And thy Lord creates whatever He pleases and selects. It is not for them to select. Glorified be Allah, and far is He above all that they associate with Him. Khalifa Rabi speaks about this in Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth, and he says, God proclaims Himself to be that Creator who selects from His own creation. This is how it should be, and this is exactly what it is. No naturalist can alter this and replace Him with a mindless creator of his own choice. In a desperate attempt to do so, they try to combine in natural selection the additional role of a creator. All they are left with is a mindless, non-personal, deaf, dumb, and blind principle which they believe must have created them. Incidentally, this brings to mind the saying, like father, like son. So Khalifa Rabi is saying that the naturalists are trying to combine selection and creation in one, whereas it doesn't make sense to do so if you're talking about anything other than God. But Allah is He who can both create things and also select them. He can choose for them to go forward, and He can shape the environments, and He can shape the biology as He goes. But you have to have an intelligent mind behind this for that to work. You can't say that this is the result of a non-intelligent, blind process. So this is was a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot more on this in the Jamaat literature. If you want to find out more about this topic, I'd recommend you go to reviewofreligions.org. In the corner, there's the search bar, and you can look. If you type in evolution, you'll find, dozens of articles essentially on evolution, and it's a wonderful resource that you can use. I'd also recommend rationalreligion.co.uk, which is a platform in the National Tabligh Department UK for which I work. And if you go to rationalreligion.co.uk, you go to the topic index, and then you go to this where the red box is, evolution. You can find, I think, between 10 and 20 articles and videos on this topic, including a lot of the things that I've spoken about today in much, much more depth. I hope, inshallah, that this has been useful for you, and I pray that you are getting great benefit from the Review of Religions God Summit. Assalamu alaikum.